The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses, lined up neatly in rows, sat bathed in the soft golden light of the morning. Birds chirped, and the faint sound of a lawnmower buzzed in the distance. It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed out of place, where life moved in its slow, predictable rhythm. But as the camera zoomed in on a particular house at the corner of Maple Street, everything was about to change. A car, an old sedan with its paint peeling, came into view, turning down the street and pulling up to the curb. The engine sputtered as the car stopped, and its driver, a young woman, stepped out. She glanced around, briefly assessing her surroundings before opening the door to unload her groceries. The car was parked too close to the driveway of the house beside her, but the driver seemed unaware, too preoccupied with the mundane task of unloading her bags. Seconds passed, but they felt like minutes. From the window of the adjacent house, a pair of sharp, calculating eyes were watching. Karen, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been keeping an eye on this block for years. Her presence in the neighborhood was undeniable. She ruled with an iron fist, enforcing her idea of order and decorum with zeal that bordered on obsession. The tension that had been building for months was about to explode. The camera cut to Karen's face, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the parked car. She had been watching from behind the blinds, and the sight of the car parked wrong sent a ripple of frustration through her. It was always something with these people. This neighborhood had become a haven for disrespect and chaos. With a deep breath, Karen threw open the door of her house, her hands gripping the handle with a white-knuckled strength. She stormed out onto the porch, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. She was dressed in her usual attire, a power suit complete with a stiff blazer and pearl necklace. But today, there was something different about her. There was an edge in her step, a fury that hadn't been there before. As she walked down the driveway, the young woman noticed her, but by then it was too late. Karen's presence seemed to fill the street. Her figure was tall, almost intimidating, her face set in a permanent scowl. As she approached the car, her hands didn't reach for a clipboard or a pen. No, today she was armed. With one fluid motion, she reached under her blazer and pulled out a gun. The young woman froze, her eyes wide with shock. She was speechless, unable to comprehend what was happening. The gun gleamed under the morning light, its presence so out of place on this tranquil street. "I've had enough of people disrespecting this neighborhood," Karen shouted, her voice booming. The words weren't just an accusation. They were a declaration. She had been patient for too long, allowing the chaos to fester, but not anymore. The young woman tried to back away, her hands raised in a gesture of peace, but Karen's anger was beyond reason. "You think you can just park wherever you want? Think again." Karen's voice was a high-pitched scream, dripping with disdain. Her eyes were wild now, her face twisted with something darker than mere frustration. The neighborhood, once a symbol of order and perfection, had become her battleground. Every minor offense was a personal attack against her, and today this small misstep, this parking violation, was the straw that broke the camel's back. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the street like a clap of thunder, shaking the stillness that had settled over the neighborhood just moments before. The young woman screamed as the bullet tore through the air, striking her in the side. She collapsed onto the pavement, the world around her spinning out of control. Karen stood over her, breathing heavily, her grip on the gun still tight. She didn't seem to notice the shocked faces staring from windows, the whispers of neighbors who had witnessed it all unfold. In her mind, she had done what was necessary. She had defended the integrity of the neighborhood, and nothing would ever be the same again. The camera lingered on the stillness of the street, the distant hum of cars, and the chirping of birds now swallowed by the gravity of what had just happened. The tension that had been building for years had finally snapped, and the repercussions of this moment would be felt by everyone in this small, unsuspecting community. As the camera pulled away from Karen, now standing in the center of the chaos she had created, the title of the story flashed across the screen. HOA, Karen shot my daughter for parking wrong. I'm the FBI director. This wasn't just a story about a parking dispute, it was about a neighborhood on the edge, a woman pushed too far, and a father who would stop at nothing to protect his own. The stage was set for a battle of wills, one that would change everything. The air seemed to thicken as Karen stormed toward the car, the heavy sound of her footsteps echoing on the quiet street. The young woman who had just stepped out of the car with her groceries in hand froze. Her heart raced, a sense of dread crawling up her spine as Karen drew closer. She could see the angry, determined look on Karen's face, the kind of look that told her there was no room for negotiation. This wasn't just about parking, this was personal. The young woman, whose name was Rachel, took a shaky step back, instinctively placing a hand on the door for support. She had heard the rumors about Karen, how she ran the HOA with a strict, unforgiving hand, but she never expected it to escalate like this. She glanced around, hoping someone would intervene, but the street was eerily quiet. The few neighbors who might have helped were staying hidden behind their curtains, their eyes locked on the confrontation that was about to unfold. "Ma'am, I don't think this is necessary," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. She could feel the tension rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. She wasn't about to let Karen push her around, not without a fight. "I'm sorry about the parking, but it was an honest mistake. I'll move the car right now, okay?" Karen's eyes flicked down to the car, then back to Rachel, her face contorted in fury. There was no sign of forgiveness in her gaze, only the cold, sharp edge of someone used to getting her way. The anger radiating off her was palpable. She wasn't interested in apologies. She was interested in control. "No, Rachel, you'll learn to respect this neighborhood." Karen spat the words, her voice rising with each syllable louder and more commanding. "This is MY Street. I run things around here, and I've had enough of people like you thinking you can just do whatever you want." Rachel took another step back, feeling the weight of Karen's words like a slap in the face. She had heard about Karen's authoritarian tendencies before, but nothing could have prepared her for the venom in her tone. Rachel's stomach twisted, and she clenched her fists, trying to suppress the growing fear threatening to choke her. "I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone," Rachel said, her voice softening, trying to appeal to any trace of reason in Karen. "I just didn't realize. I'll move the car, I swear. There's no need for this to go any further." Karen didn't respond. She was too far gone, too consumed by her need to control the situation, to bend the world to her will. Her eyes flared with anger, and without warning, her hand darted to the side, pulling something from under her jacket. Rachel's eyes widened as she recognized the cold, hard steel of a gun. Time seemed to slow. The words left Rachel's mouth in a rush. "Karen, don't," but it was too late. Karen was already beyond reason, her rage boiling over, her grip on the weapon tight and unyielding. "You think you can just park here, like it's nothing? Like you're above the rules?" Karen shouted, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You'll learn the hard way that people like you don't get to disrespect this neighborhood. Not while I'm in charge." The gun was now pointed directly at Rachel, its barrel glinting in the morning light. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively took a step back, her hands raised in defense. She had no idea what to do, no idea how to de-escalate this situation before it spiraled even further out of control. "Karen, please," Rachel pleaded, her voice shaking. "This isn't necessary. Just put the gun down. We can fix this, okay? I'll do whatever you want. Just don't shoot." But Karen was too far gone. Her eyes were wild, unblinking, as if the world around her had become a blur. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about power, control, and domination. And in that moment, Rachel realized that nothing would satisfy Karen's hunger for power, not even an apology. "You think an apology will fix this?" Karen snapped, her voice breaking under the weight of her fury. "You think saying you're sorry will make everything okay? You've ruined everything, and now you're going to pay for it. You'll learn not to cross me." The words echoed in Rachel's mind, and for a split second, everything went dark. Her pulse raced, her vision tunneled, and the gun in Karen's hand seemed to consume the entire world. All of Rachel's thoughts ran together in a frantic blur, but one thought kept cutting through. This was real. This was happening. The tension in the air was suffocating. The world seemed to stop as Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. Rachel's breath hitched in her chest, and in that brief moment before the shot, she wondered if she would ever make it out of this alive. Bang! The shot rang out, deafening, like a thunderclap splitting the sky. The world around Rachel exploded in chaos, and she collapsed to the ground in agony, her body unable to handle the shock of what had just occurred. The pain was immediate, intense, and overwhelming, and the world around her blurred in a wash of red and black. Karen stood over her, staring down at the aftermath of her actions, the gun still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't seem to care about the life she had just taken or the damage she had inflicted on this once peaceful neighborhood. To her, this was just another step toward asserting her control. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's body lay on the ground, trembling, unable to move. The world around her spun, the pain too much to bear. And in the distance, the sound of sirens began to wail, signaling the start of the chaos that was now unfolding. The air was thick with tension as Karen stood over Rachel, the gun in her hand now aimed directly at the young woman's chest. Karen's eyes were wild with anger, her face a mask of fury, and yet there was something almost cold in her gaze. She didn't seem to be registering the consequences of what she was about to do. In her mind, this was justified. Her authority had been challenged, and she was about to put an end to it once and for all. Rachel's chest heaved as she gasped for air, her eyes darting from the gun to Karen's face, trying to make sense of the situation. She couldn't believe what was happening. The gun was real. This wasn't a threat anymore. It was life or death. The weight of the situation hit her in waves, and for a moment, she couldn't think. All she could feel was the beating of her own heart in her chest, the pounding in her ears as the world seemed to slow down around her. "Karen, please just listen to me," Rachel cried out, her voice shaking. She took another step back, her hands still raised, trying to show she was no threat. "This has gone too far. You don't need to do this." But Karen's expression remained unwavering. She wasn't listening. The words didn't matter to her. There was only one thing on her mind now: making an example of Rachel. Karen's finger tightened around the trigger, and with a swift, chilling motion, she pulled it. The sound of the gunshot shattered the morning silence with a deafening crack, as though the air itself had been split open. Time seemed to stretch in that instant, the force of the sound ringing in Rachel's ears. It was as if the world held its breath before it all came crashing down. The bullet tore through the air, and Rachel's body jerked violently as it struck her side. Her breath caught in her throat as pain exploded across her chest. Her vision momentarily clouded, with a rush of sharp, unbearable agony. Rachel staggered back, her knees buckling beneath her, and before she could even react, her body collapsed to the ground. The impact of the fall was jarring, the pavement scraping against her skin as she crumpled in a heap. The world around her spun in chaotic flashes of light and shadow. Her thoughts were disjointed, like an out-of-focus image slowly coming into view, but all she could comprehend was the searing pain, the blood staining the side of her clothes, and the heavy, suffocating weight of fear in her chest. Karen stood over her, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, her fingers still on the trigger, but she made no move to fire again. The world around them seemed to pause. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, but Karen wasn't showing any remorse. Her eyes were locked on Rachel, her lips trembling as though she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. But there was no turning back now. The sounds of the neighborhood, once calm and peaceful, were now interrupted by the chaos of the moment. From the windows of nearby houses, horrified faces stared down, frozen in shock. Neighbors who had been watching in disbelief now began to react. Some shouted, others rushed to the phone to call for help. In a distant corner of the street, the muffled sound of a car engine could be heard pulling away. Someone had seen the incident unfold and was already on their way to get help. In a flash, the quiet suburban street had transformed into a scene of horror. The once placid neighborhood, where nothing ever happened, was now ground zero for an unimaginable tragedy. Rachel's body lay on the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the blood oozed from her wound, staining the pavement beneath her. Her vision was growing darker, her body weaker with each passing second. She could hear the distant sound of sirens, but everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. She tried to speak, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was overwhelming, and her head was spinning, her vision blurring around the edges. Karen, meanwhile, took a step back, her hand shaking as she lowered the gun, still aimed at Rachel's fallen form. She couldn't bring herself to look away from the scene she had just created. Her mind raced, but her emotions were a twisted, tangled mess of confusion and denial. She didn't know how to feel. There was no relief, no satisfaction, just an empty, hollow echo in her chest. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you left me no choice," Karen muttered, the words almost to herself. They lacked conviction, a hollow justification to mask the guilt that was beginning to creep in. But she wasn't ready to face that just yet. Not now. Karen's eyes flicked over to the neighbors watching from their windows, and her expression shifted, quickly hardening into one of defiance. She had done it. She had made her point. No one would question her again. No one would dare challenge her authority in this neighborhood again. That much was certain. But the damage was done. Rachel's body lay lifeless on the ground, and the once quiet suburban street had become a crime scene. As the first sirens echoed closer, Karen knew she had crossed the line. There would be no going back from this. The sound of the sirens sliced through the air, growing louder as the FBI director, David Bennett, raced down the street, his mind racing as fast as his footsteps. The call had come in just moments ago, a call that had shattered the calm of his world. His daughter, Rachel, had been shot in broad daylight by none other than Karen, the HOA president. It didn't matter that he was the FBI director. Nothing in his career, no matter how many cases he'd solved, had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't just a man of authority anymore. He wasn't just the head of one of the most powerful investigative agencies in the world. He was a father, and his daughter was lying in the street, bleeding out, in need of help. As he approached the scene, the sight of the flashing blue and red lights filled his vision, and for a brief moment he hesitated. The anger inside him, the fierce protectiveness that came from being a father, threatened to consume him. He had always prided himself on his composure, his ability to separate his personal life from his work, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal investigation, it was his family, and the person responsible for this was someone who had been living under his nose. Karen. He pushed through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk, their murmurs growing louder as they tried to piece together what had happened. Some recognized him immediately, others were too frightened to even make eye contact. He was the FBI director, a man they had all seen on TV and read about in the papers, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was his daughter, his little girl, who was fighting for her life. David rushed to the scene, his eyes scanning the area with precision, but his gaze never wavered from Rachel. She was lying on the ground, her body motionless. The paramedics were already on site, working desperately to stabilize her, but the blood was pooling around her, and David could see the fear in the eyes of the medical team. It was bad. Too bad. "Rachel," David muttered under his breath, his voice cracking as he knelt beside her. He could barely recognize her face, twisted with pain, her skin pale, as if life was slowly draining from her. She had always been strong, independent like him. But now she was lying here, a victim of a woman he had thought he knew. "Dad?" Rachel whispered faintly, her voice weak and trembling. Her hand reached out to him, and David grabbed it, his heart shattering at the sight of her suffering. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm right here. You're going to be okay. They're going to fix you up, all right? You're going to be fine." But even as the words left his mouth, David knew the truth. He didn't know if she was going to be fine. Not yet. Not until they caught Karen, the woman who had pulled the trigger. Until he found out why she'd gone this far. Why she'd destroyed their lives. David's mind snapped into action. He rose to his feet, his professional instincts kicking in. He was no longer just a father. He was an FBI director on the hunt for a criminal. He scanned the scene, taking in every detail, his eyes moving from the blood-stained pavement to the gun still lying in the middle of the road, a testament to the violence that had unfolded just moments ago. The officers on the scene were already taking statements from the neighbors, trying to piece together what had happened, but no one seemed to have seen the exact moment the shot had been fired. Karen had been fast, too fast. She had acted in cold, unrelenting anger, and now she was nowhere to be found. David's mind raced as he processed the information. He couldn't afford to waste time. Rachel's life was at stake, and he needed to get Karen behind bars before she could do anything else. He turned to the officers, his voice firm, commanding, "Get a team to track down Karen immediately. I want every resource at our disposal. We need to bring her in before she can hide or flee. No one is leaving this neighborhood until we have her." The officers nodded and moved quickly, already making phone calls and organizing teams. David's thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. Karen had taken something precious from him, and he wasn't going to rest until she paid for it. He couldn't allow her to get away with it, not when his daughter was fighting for her life. As the medical team prepared to transport Rachel to the hospital, David stood back, his fists clenched at his sides. The image of his daughter, pale and broken, was seared into his mind. He had seen death before. He had faced terrorists, criminals, and corrupt officials in his career. But this was different. This was personal. "I'm not just the FBI director," David muttered to himself, his voice low but resolute. "I'm a father, and I will make this right." He watched as the paramedics loaded Rachel into the ambulance, his heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. He couldn't help but feel helpless, unable to protect her when she needed him most. But as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped off, his resolve hardened. The anger was now an undeniable force inside him, a driving motivation. Karen had crossed a line, and he would make sure she paid for it. His duty to the FBI had always come first, but in this moment his duty to his family, to his daughter, took precedence. David knew this would not be an easy battle, but he was ready. He would bring Karen to justice, no matter the cost. The investigation was moving slower than David would have liked. It was only a few hours since the shooting, but already the pressure was building. The FBI team had arrived at the scene, but despite their best efforts, Karen was nowhere to be found. The neighborhood, once bustling with the usual hum of suburban life, was now eerily quiet. With only a few officers still canvassing the area, everyone was waiting for the inevitable, an arrest. But the more David delved into the details, the more it seemed like Karen had planned this moment meticulously, covering her tracks with an unsettling degree of expertise. David stood outside his house, staring at the distant ambulance that had taken Rachel to the hospital. His daughter's condition was still critical, but the doctors were doing everything they could. He forced himself to focus, to think like an agent rather than a father. The situation was dire, and he needed answers. "Sir, we've canvassed the entire neighborhood, and no one has seen Karen since the shooting," one of the agents reported, his voice tense as he handed over a stack of papers filled with witness statements. David didn't look at the papers. He was too focused on the task at hand. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every detail that had led them here. Karen's cold demeanor, the way she'd pulled the trigger without hesitation. It wasn't just about parking, it was about power. Karen had always been controlling, but this was something else. She hadn't acted impulsively. She'd planned it. "We need to find her before she disappears," David muttered under his breath. "She's got connections, and she's not going to let herself go down without a fight." As if on cue, another officer approached, his face grim. "Sir, we've confirmed that Karen is indeed well-connected. She's part of a private club of influential community members. We've traced her phone records, and it looks like she reached out to someone after the shooting. We're digging into that now." David's mind immediately went into overdrive. Karen had made a mistake. She had reached out to someone, and that someone could lead them straight to her. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this was going to be complicated. Karen had always been able to use her position in the community to her advantage, manipulating situations, using her wealth and status to get what she wanted. She had always been untouchable, and now she was playing the same game with the FBI. Any luck finding her vehicle? David asked, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the lead investigator. The agent shook his head. No sign of her car. It's like she vanished into thin air. David cursed under his breath. Karen knew the system. She knew how to disappear when it mattered, and she knew how to play the game. He had underestimated her. He had thought that, as the FBI director, his family would be protected. But Karen had found a way to strike back. The hours passed, and despite all their efforts, the case seemed to stall. The witnesses were all too afraid to speak up. No one wanted to cross Karen, not when they knew she had the power to ruin lives. And Rachel, who had once been the shining light of the neighborhood, was now in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, her silence a reminder of how quickly everything could change. As the night drew on, David found himself in the office, surrounded by piles of evidence, case files, and the flickering glow of the overhead lights. His team had been working nonstop, but they were running out of leads. Karen had covered her tracks too well. Just as he was about to take a break, his phone rang. The name on the screen made his blood run cold, Karen Prescott. He stared at the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he answered. "Karen," he said, his voice low but controlled. "What do you want?" On the other end of the line, Karen's voice was icy, dripping with the same confidence that had been there earlier that day. David, you really think you can take me down?" David's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching. The nerve of her. To call him, to speak as if she hadn't just tried to kill his daughter. But he knew this was part of her game. She was playing him. She was testing him, trying to manipulate the situation in her favor. "Where are you?" David demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm coming for you. You're not going to get away with this." "Oh, I don't think you understand," Karen replied, her tone almost mocking. "You think you can just waltz in and arrest me? You don't know who you're dealing with. I've been in control of this neighborhood for years, and I always get what I want. You really think I'm afraid of you?" David's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the arrogance in her voice, the belief that she was untouchable. But he couldn't let her know how much she had shaken him. He couldn't show weakness. "I'll make sure you pay for what you did to my daughter," David said, his words cold, calculating. "You're going to regret this, Karen." She laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in his ears. "We'll see, won't we? But for now, you're wasting your time. I'm already one step ahead of you." With that, she hung up, leaving David in stunned silence. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. She was right. She had played him. She knew exactly how to push his buttons, how to turn the tables in her favor. David felt a surge of rage. Karen had underestimated him, though. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He slammed the phone down onto the desk, his hands clenched into fists. The investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. But David was done playing by her rules. He was going to take her down, no matter what it took. He was done being reactive. It was time to go on the offensive. "Get me everything we have on Karen Prescott," David ordered, his voice like steel. "We're going to find her. And when we do, she's going to regret crossing me." The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, and as David sat at his desk, poring over the new batch of intel the team had gathered, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Karen Prescott, once just a figurehead of the local homeowners association, had quickly become something far more dangerous, someone with connections, power, and a history of manipulation that stretched far beyond the suburban streets she had controlled for so long. David had assumed Karen's actions were simply a result of her obsessive need to control the neighborhood. What he hadn't expected was the dark history buried beneath the surface, a history of intimidation and coercion that had allowed Karen to tighten her grip on the town for years. As he read through the newly uncovered files, his fingers paused on a particular document, an old real estate transaction with an unusually high amount of money exchanging hands. This doesn't make sense, David muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. The deal had involved the sale of several properties in the neighborhood, but the buyer was someone David hadn't heard of before. A name that seemed almost too obscure, Axton Wren, a name that wasn't on any official records of the town. His suspicion grew, and he knew that he needed to dig deeper into this. "Where's the rest of this file?" he asked his lead investigator, who was standing by in the doorway. The agent handed over a thick stack of files, and as David sifted through them, the truth began to reveal itself, piece by piece. Axton Wren, it seemed, was no mere investor. He was a criminal with ties to organized crime, specifically in money laundering and real estate scams. The more David read, the more the pieces fell into place. Karen had been involved in the shady dealings for years. She had used her position in the HOA to secure these properties, manipulating homeowners into selling under duress, and then flipping the properties for profit, all while maintaining the image of a model citizen. But that was just the beginning. David's heart raced as he connected the dots. Karen had built her influence over the years by using fear and manipulation to silence anyone who dared to question her. There were whispers of her intimidation tactics, threats to ruin people's lives if they didn't comply with her demands, lies spread behind closed doors, and people who had mysteriously disappeared from the community, never to be heard from again. David knew that Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was someone who had made her living off of other people's misery. She was a predator, and this neighborhood had been her prey. The investigation unearthed even more disturbing connections. Karen had been laundering money for years, using the property she controlled as a front to disguise the illicit transactions. The more David learned, the more chilling it became. Karen's empire was built on fear, deception, and a series of quiet, well-placed manipulations. People had been too afraid to speak out, too scared to lose their homes, their livelihoods. All the while, Karen had moved through life with impunity, her power unchecked by anyone who could stand up to her. "I've been pulling the strings in this town for years. You don't scare me." David recalled Karen's voice in his mind, the words echoing with an unsettling truth. She believed she was untouchable. She believed no one could break her hold on the community. But she had underestimated him. David took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery sinking in. He had known Karen was ruthless, but this was a new level of danger. She wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was a criminal mastermind, and he was going to bring her down, no matter how deeply she had buried her secrets. The phone rang, breaking David from his thoughts. He picked it up without hesitation. "Bennett." "Sir, we've found something," the voice on the other end said, urgency in their tone. "We've traced one of Karen's contacts, Axton Wren. We think he's her source for laundering money. We've got an address, and we're ready to move in." David stood up, adrenaline surging through him. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach. He couldn't let Karen get away with this any longer. She had hurt his daughter, and now he was going to make sure she paid for everything she had done to the people of the town, for every lie, every manipulation, every crime. "I'm on my way," David said, his voice a steel edge of determination. He hung up and quickly made his way to the car, his mind set on one thing: justice. As he drove through the quiet streets, David reflected on everything he had uncovered. The power Karen had amassed through fear was staggering. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how many others she had hurt, how many lives she had destroyed for her own gain. But that was going to end now. David had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to follow the rules and let justice take its course. But as the reality of Karen's dark past hit him, something shifted. He wasn't just chasing a criminal anymore. He was chasing a person who had made it personal. And he was going to make sure that Karen Prescott never had the power to hurt anyone again. By the time he reached the address, the entire team was already in position, ready to confront Karen's criminal empire. They had the evidence. They had the intel. Now, it was time to take her down. The sterile, antiseptic scent of the hospital filled the air, heavy and suffocating as David walked down the hallway toward Rachel's room. Every step felt like it was carrying a ton of bricks, his mind weighed down by the gravity of what had happened. His daughter, the person he had sworn to protect above all else, was fighting for her life in that room. Her condition was critical, and though the doctors were doing everything they could, there were no guarantees. He pushed open the door, his eyes immediately searching for his wife, Emily. She was sitting in the corner of the room, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying, her face pale, drained of the strength it had once carried. When she saw David, her expression softened, but there was no relief in her eyes, only the same quiet desperation that had settled over the both of them since Rachel was shot. "How is she?" David asked softly, his voice breaking as he took a few steps forward. He needed to know, needed to hear that there was hope, even if it was only a sliver. Emily looked up, her lips pressing together in a thin, strained line. "The doctors are doing everything they can," she replied. But David could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "But she's not out of the woods yet, David. She's still unconscious." David swallowed hard, his stomach churning as he looked over at Rachel's motionless form in the hospital bed. His daughter, once so full of life, now looked fragile, vulnerable, as if everything about her had been stripped away in an instant. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder of the uncertainty hanging over them. His eyes burned, but he refused to let the tears fall. "Not yet." Emily reached out, her hand brushing against his. "David, I can't lose her. I can't lose our little girl. We need to do something. We need to make sure that Karen pays for what she's done." David's gaze turned toward her, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had been focused on bringing Karen down, on making sure the law took its course, but hearing his wife's plea, hearing the raw emotion in her voice, shifted something inside him. "I'm going to make sure she pays, Emily," he said, his tone resolute. "But this isn't just a case. It's my family. You think I don't want to tear Karen apart for what she did to Rachel? You think I don't want to make her regret everything she's ever done? But the truth is, Emily, the fight is just beginning." He turned away for a moment, his mind spinning as the weight of the situation crushed him. Karen Prescott hadn't just shot Rachel. She had shattered the fragile peace they had all lived in. And now every decision they made, every move David made, felt like it was a choice between justice and losing the last vestiges of his family. "I know it's hard," Emily said, her voice breaking as she stood up and walked over to him. "But we can't wait. We can't let this woman get away with what she's done. You have the power to make things right. Use it, David. Use everything you've got." David clenched his fists at his sides, trying to control the anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long. He had already promised himself that he would bring Karen to justice, but hearing Emily's words made him question whether he was doing enough. He had been consumed with finding Karen, with dismantling her criminal empire, but he hadn't thought about how deeply his family was suffering in the process. "I am doing everything I can," David said, the words thick in his throat. "But this isn't just about taking her down. We need to make sure Rachel gets through this. We need to be here for her." Emily's eyes softened, but there was still a trace of frustration in her gaze. "And you will be. But don't forget that the law can't fix everything. Sometimes it's not enough to wait for justice to run its course. Sometimes you need to act." David's mind raced as he tried to process everything she was saying. His position as FBI director, his years of service, he had spent his entire life upholding the law, trusting in it to right the wrongs of the world. But as he looked at his wife, the woman who had always been his partner in every sense of the word, he realized that the law wasn't going to give him the closure he needed. The law couldn't fix the pain he saw in Emily's eyes, the fear and heartbreak that had replaced the love they had once shared. "I don't know if I can do this, Emily," David confessed, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if I can fight this battle and still keep our family intact. Every day, it feels like I'm losing a little more of myself." Emily moved closer, her arms wrapping around him in a rare moment of tenderness. "You don't have to do it alone, David," she whispered. "We're in this together." We always have been. David closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace in her embrace. The weight of everything, the investigation, the crime, Rachel's condition, felt like it was too much to bear. But in this moment, Emily's words offered him something he hadn't felt in days: hope. Hope that they could get through this together, as a family, despite everything. "I won't let her destroy us," David said, his voice firm again, though it was tinged with the quiet grief that had settled in his chest. "I won't let Karen Prescott win. But we'll do this right. For Rachel. For us." They stood there for a moment longer, the sound of the hospital bustling around them muted by the shared understanding that their world had irrevocably changed. But despite the uncertainty, despite the fear, David knew one thing for certain: he would fight for his family. He would fight for Rachel, and he would make sure that Karen Prescott never hurt another soul again. The night had fallen, and David stood outside the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the dimly lit building, its rusted metal doors reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. After days of gathering intel, tracking down leads, and piecing together Karen's criminal empire, they had finally cornered her. David knew this wouldn't be easy. Karen had always been one step ahead, always prepared for the worst. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a survivor. But tonight, the tables were turned. He had the evidence. He had the team. And most importantly, he had the will to end this nightmare once and for all. "Are we ready?" David asked, his voice low but steady. His eyes scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. This wasn't just about bringing Karen to justice anymore. It was personal. His lead investigator, Agent Pierce, nodded firmly. "We've got eyes on all exits. We've traced her movements. She's here, and we've got her cornered. This is it." David felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly followed by a cold determination. He had spent too long letting Karen wreak havoc in his life, in his daughter's life, and in the lives of everyone in this town. Tonight, it ended. They moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the cracked asphalt as they approached the warehouse. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension almost suffocating. David's mind was racing as he thought of Rachel, still recovering in the hospital, and Emily, who had been his rock throughout the past few days. They had been through so much, but Karen's actions had forced David to step into a world he hadn't wanted to enter, one where justice wasn't always as clear-cut as he had once believed. They reached the door, and Agent Pierce gestured for everyone to take position. David's hand rested on the cold metal of his gun as he nodded to his team. "On my count, we go in." He didn't need to say more. They had all seen what Karen was capable of, and they knew this would be a dangerous operation. The stakes were high, and there was no room for error. 1, 2, 3. In an instant, the team breached the door, moving swiftly into the dimly lit interior of the warehouse. The echo of their boots against the concrete floor seemed to reverberate through the vast, empty space. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, the silence punctuated only by their breathing. David's eyes flicked to the shadows, every muscle in his body tense, ready for anything. Karen could be anywhere, hiding in the dark corners, waiting to make her move. He wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers now. "Clear." Agent Pierce called from the left side. "Clear." Another agent responded, signaling the other side. David took a deep breath, his gaze focused ahead. The warehouse stretched out before him, filled with boxes and old equipment. It was an odd, quiet kind of place for a showdown. No more games. No more negotiations. This was it. As they advanced deeper into the warehouse, David could hear faint footsteps echoing in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He had found her. Karen emerged from the shadows, a cold, almost predatory look on her face. She was standing near a stack of crates, her back to a wall, her gun held loosely in one hand. But her demeanor was different than before. There was no rage in her eyes this time, no overblown authority. There was only the calm, confident expression of someone who had already decided they had nothing to lose. "So, You finally found me, Karen said, her voice cold and calculating. Took you long enough. David stepped forward, his hand still on his weapon. It's over, Karen. You've been running from the law for too long. It ends tonight. Karen's lips curled into a bitter smile. You think you can just walk in here and take me down? I've spent years building this empire, David. You have no idea what I'm capable of. I know exactly what you're capable of, David shot back, his voice steady but edged with anger. You've hurt too many people. You tried to destroy my family, and now you're going to answer for it. For a moment, there was silence. The tension was thick, the standoff hanging in the air. David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the finality of it all. There was no turning back. Karen's eyes flicked to the gun in her hand, and David's muscles tensed, ready for the worst. But she didn't raise the weapon. Instead, she let out a soft, humorless laugh. You really think you're going to stop me? She sneered. You're just like everyone else, thinking you can take me down when all I've done is protect this town, protect it from people like you. David's patience snapped. You don't get to play the victim, Karen. You've used people, you've manipulated them, and you've hurt too many people for too long. This is where it ends. Without warning, Karen moved. Her hand shot out, and she tried to raise the gun, but before she could fire, David lunged, his training kicking in. He grabbed her arm, twisting it so the gun fell to the floor with a loud clatter. The struggle was brief, but it was intense. Karen, for all her cold composure, was still a woman desperate to escape. David pinned her to the ground, his chest heaving as he held her in place. It's over, he said again, the words this time carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. As more agents moved in to secure the area and cuff Karen, David took a long breath, his anger finally starting to recede, replaced by a sense of quiet relief. It was over. The woman who had terrorized his family and destroyed so many lives had finally been caught. But as they led Karen away in handcuffs, David couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of this victory was far greater than he could have imagined. The battle might be won, but the scars would remain. His family would never be the same. And yet, as he stood there in the cold, dim light of the warehouse, he knew that for the first time in days he had done the right thing. The law had won, and Karen Prescott was no longer a threat. The weight of the arrest settled over David like a heavy fog, lingering in the air long after Karen had been taken away in the back of a squad car. The clink of handcuffs, the muffled voices of the officers as they processed her, all seemed distant to David. He stood alone in the middle of the warehouse, surrounded by the quiet hum of the team finishing their sweep. The adrenaline that had surged through him moments ago had dissipated, leaving behind an almost hollow feeling. Karen Prescott had been brought to justice, but something about the victory felt incomplete. The battle was won, but the war against the damage Karen had caused, against the pieces of his family that had been broken, was far from over. As the team wrapped up the scene, David felt a sudden urgency to get to the hospital. He had to see Rachel. He had to know that his daughter was still fighting, still hanging on to life. The drive to the hospital was a blur. His mind raced through the events of the day, the confrontation, the chase, the moment when Karen had finally surrendered. It had been everything he'd worked for. But now, all he could think about was Rachel. What if she didn't make it? What if this whole ordeal, this entire nightmare, had been in vain? He parked in the hospital lot, the headlights of the car cutting through the night as he rushed inside. The sterile smell of the hospital hit him immediately as he made his way down the hallway, his pace quickening. Emily was sitting outside Rachel's room when he arrived, her head resting in her hands, her eyes red from the tears that had yet to dry. When she saw him, she stood quickly, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. David, you did it, Emily whispered, her voice hoarse, as if the words were still hard to believe. David nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. Karen's in custody. She's going to pay for everything she's done. Emily took a step toward him, her arms open. He embraced her tightly, the familiar warmth of her body, a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. But Rachel? Emily asked, her voice trembling. How is she? What did the doctors say? David pulled back slightly, his expression darkening. They're doing everything they can, but they won't know the full extent until she wakes up. She's still unconscious. Emily closed her eyes, biting her lip, trying to hold back the tears. David knew that she was as desperate for their daughter to pull through as he was. I don't know how much longer I can do this. David, I'm so scared. David took her hands in his voice firm but soft. We're in this together, Emily. We've always been. Rachel's a fighter. She's got more strength than any of us. The silence that followed was thick, both of them lost in their thoughts. David's mind flashed to Rachel's room, to the image of her lying unconscious, hooked to machines, her body still and vulnerable. He couldn't help but feel that everything they had endured, the stress, the fear, the constant threat from Karen, had led them to this point. Rachel's life had been torn apart by someone they never imagined would become their enemy. But now that Karen was in custody, would it even be enough to heal the wounds? Before David could voice his next thoughts, the door to Rachel's room opened and the doctor stepped out, his face unreadable. David and Emily both turned toward him, their breath held in anticipation. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, the doctor began, I want to assure you that we are doing everything we can for your daughter. She's stable for now, but we need to monitor her condition closely over the next 24 hours. The gunshot wound was serious, but she's a young woman with a strong will. We're hopeful. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emily clutched his arm, her grip tight. Can we see her? The doctor nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. She's awake for short periods, but she's still very weak. You can go in, but she'll need rest. Please be gentle with her. David and Emily exchanged a look before walking into Rachel's room. The sight of her lying there, her face pale and bruised, was enough to steal the breath from David's lungs. She had been the life of the house, the spark that kept them all grounded, and now she looked so fragile. But even in her unconscious state, her strength was apparent. Emily walked over to her side, brushing a stray lock of hair from Rachel's forehead. Sweetheart, she whispered, her voice breaking. We're here, Rachel. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. David stood behind her, his hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder. He couldn't find the words. Nothing felt right. The joy of Karen's arrest was overshadowed by the uncertainty of Rachel's condition. His daughter had been caught in a war that wasn't hers to fight, a war that had been forced upon them by someone who had no right to wield that kind of power. For a moment, all David could do was stand there, watching his wife as she held their daughter's hand, her eyes filled with love, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He knew they had won the battle, but they had paid a heavy price for it. She's going to be okay, David whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the strength she needed. We'll make sure of it. We'll make sure she's okay, David. David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. They would get through this, together. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, but at least they had a chance to rebuild their lives, to reclaim their peace. And that, David knew, was worth everything. For the first time since Rachel had been shot, he felt a flicker of hope. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a soft light over the sterile room. David sat by Rachel's bed, his hand resting gently on hers. She was still asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. The worst of the storm had passed, but the journey ahead was far from over. Her road to recovery would be long, and the emotional scars from the trauma would take time to heal. David couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. The way Karen had pointed the gun at Rachel, the deafening crack of the shot, the helpless feeling that had washed over him as he realized his daughter's life was hanging in the balance. He had been powerless to stop it in that moment, and the weight of that helplessness still lingered in his chest. But now, as he sat here with Rachel, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect his family. He glanced over at Emily, who was sitting in the corner, her face tired but determined. She had been there every step of the way, holding Rachel's hand during her darkest moments, refusing to leave her side. David couldn't express how much that had meant to him. They had always been partners, but this ordeal had brought them closer in ways that words couldn't describe. They had faced the worst together, and now they would rebuild together. David, Emily said softly, her voice a gentle whisper. She had been watching him, her eyes filled with understanding. We've been through so much, but we're still here. And Rachel's still here. David nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I know. I keep thinking about everything that's happened. About Karen. How could someone like her exist? How could she do something so cruel? Emily stood and walked over to him, sitting beside him at the bed. She gently placed her hand over his, offering him comfort. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could control everyone, even with the damage she was causing. But we stopped her. We didn't let her win. You didn't let her win. David sighed, looking down at Rachel's face. She looked so peaceful now, the marks of the trauma slowly fading as her body healed. The scars would remain, both physical and emotional. But David vowed to do everything in his power to help her move past this. I couldn't save her that day, Emily, he whispered. I couldn't protect her from Karen. It haunts me. Emily squeezed his hand, her voice steady but soft. You saved her in the end. You got her the help she needed. And you've been here for her every step of the way since then. That's what matters. David felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. His wife had always been his anchor, his grounding force in the storm. It was because of her that he had been able to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. I know we've made it through the worst of it, but sometimes it still feels like everything is broken. Like I can't fix what Karen did to us. To Rachel. You don't have to fix everything, Emily said, her voice calm and reassuring. What happened with Karen, what she did to Rachel, it's not something you can just erase. But we're here now. We have each other. We can rebuild from this. David looked at Emily, his heart swelling with appreciation. She was right. There would be no erasing the scars left by Karen's cruelty, but there was something stronger than the damage. Love. His love for Emily, for Rachel, for the life they had built together. That was what would help them heal. It was what had kept them going, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. David leaned forward, pressing a kiss to Rachel's forehead. He felt her stir slightly, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly woke up. The sight of her, her eyes blinking up at him with confusion and exhaustion, made his heart ache. But she was alive. She was awake. She had survived. Hey, sweetie, David whispered softly, his voice cracking with emotion. How are you feeling? Rachel's eyes focused on him, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze. Then, as if realizing the gravity of what had happened, she blinked again, tears welling up in her eyes. Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Is it really over? Is she gone? David's throat tightened as he nodded. It's over, sweetheart. Karen's in custody. You're safe now. Rachel's hand reached out weakly, and David took it in his. Her grip was faint but strong enough to remind him of her resilience. Emily leaned in, brushing a tear from her cheek as she smiled down at Rachel. We're going to get through this, honey. We're going to heal together. David looked at his family, his heart full. There was so much they had lost in the past few days, so much they had been forced to endure. But now, standing here together, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. They would rebuild, they would heal, and they would be stronger because of it. I love you both so much, David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We'll make it through. We'll make sure that nothing and no one can hurt us again. Rachel's eyes fluttered once more, and she gave a faint nod, her lips curling into a soft, fragile smile. David knew it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long, and the scars of this ordeal would never completely fade. But in that moment, as he sat with his family, he knew one thing: they had survived, and that was something no one could take from them. If you want to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to HOA Denied Access, where justice, suspense, and the fight for what's right never stop. Don't miss a moment. Hit that notification bell and stay with us for more gripping tales. HOA Denied Access is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.